October 1842, the Tennessee border. Ezekiel Brown's hands trembled as he carved the 13th mark into the oak tree. 13 souls lost to the darkness beyond the river. 13 warnings ignored. The old preacher had come to this forsaken corner of the Tennessee wilderness 3 months prior, sent by the Baptist Mission Society to minister to the scattered settlements. But what he'd found here defied every teaching in his well-worn Bible. The locals spoke in whispers of the place across the Hiwassee River, a stretch of ancient Cherokee land where the trees grew wrong, where mist clung to the ground even under the noonday sun, and where 500 escaped slaves had vanished 12 years ago. Vanished, but not gone. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Reverend," came a voice behind him. Ezekiel turned to find Jeremiah Blackwood, the settlement's blacksmith, a bear of a man with soot-stained hands and eyes that had seen too much. Jeremiah carried his hammer even now, as if iron could protect against what lurked in these woods. "The Lord is my shepherd, Brother Blackwood. I fear no evil." "Then you're a fool." Jeremiah spat tobacco juice onto the moss-covered ground. "That land across the river ain't the Lord's territory no more. Hasn't been since the Cherokee laid their curse before the soldiers drove them west on the Trail of Tears." Ezekiel had heard the story a dozen times, each telling more elaborate than the last. In 1830, when the Indian Removal Act passed, a group of Cherokee medicine men had performed a ritual on that particular stretch of land, a sanctuary, they called it. They'd opened something, created a place between worlds where those who were hunted could hide, where the desperate could find refuge. The first to discover it were the runaways. In the spring of 1830, a woman named Delilah Hayes had led her people through the Underground Railroad to this spot. 500 men, women, and children fleeing the plantation horrors of Georgia and Carolina. They'd been pursued by slave catchers, dogs baying in the night, certain death at their heels. And then they'd crossed the river into the sanctuary. The slave catchers had followed. 40 men, armed and angry, had ridden into those woods. Only 3 came back out, and they came back wrong. They spoke of trees that whispered names, of shadows that moved against the light, of Delilah Hayes standing before them with eyes that burned like coals, speaking in tongues that predated English, predated Cherokee, predated anything human. One of those men, Silas Crow, now sat in a cell in Nashville, rocking and muttering prayers that never ended. Another had walked into the Cumberland River with stones in his pockets. The third, Nathaniel Pike, lived in a shack 5 miles from here and wouldn't speak of what he'd seen except when the fever dreams took him. "They're still in there," Jeremiah continued, his voice dropping low. "All 500. Been 12 years, Reverend. 12 years and not one of them has crossed back over that river. You know what that means?" Ezekiel knew. In 12 years, people needed food, medicine, supplies. In 12 years, some would die, some would be born, some would surely want to leave. But the sanctuary remained silent, sealed, a wound in the world that wouldn't close. "I've been called to minister to the lost," Ezekiel said, though his conviction wavered. "Then minister here, where folks still got souls worth saving." Jeremiah pointed back toward the settlement. 3 days ago, Constance Miller's boy went missing. Found his shoes by the riverbank this morning. That makes 13, Reverend. 13 people who got curious, who got too close, who thought they could peek behind the curtain. Ezekiel looked at his carved marks, each one representing a life swallowed by the sanctuary. The latest was fresh young Thomas Miller, only 16 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. "What do the Cherokee say about it?" Ezekiel asked. Jeremiah's laugh was bitter. "Ain't no Cherokee left to ask. The few who remained after the removal won't speak of it. There's an old woman, Aida, lives up in the hills. She was there when the medicine men opened the sanctuary, but she won't talk to white men about it. Says we wouldn't understand. Says we can't understand." The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that made Ezekiel's stomach turn sweet rot and wild herbs, smoke, and something older, something that smelled like the earth before mankind walked upon it. From across the river, barely audible, came the sound of singing. Spirituals, the old songs the slaves sang in the fields, but changed somehow, twisted into harmonies that hurt to hear. Ezekiel recognized wade in the water, but the words were different now. Wrong, speaking of waters that didn't cleanse but transformed, that didn't save but claimed. They're calling, Jeremiah whispered. Every night, when the mist rises, they sing, drawing people in. Don't listen, Reverend. Don't let their songs get into your head. But Ezekiel was already listening, his heart racing with equal parts terror and terrible curiosity. Somewhere in that cursed sanctuary, 500 souls lived in a freedom that came at a price he couldn't yet comprehend. And young Thomas Miller had just become the latest to pay it. October 1842, 3 days later, Ezekiel found Constance Miller in her cabin, surrounded by the relics of her lost son. The widow sat in a rocking chair that no longer rocked, her hands clutching Thomas's Sunday shirt, her eyes fixed on something beyond the walls, beyond the world of the living. He heard them singing, she said before Ezekiel could offer his condolences. Her voice was hollow, scraped clean of grief, leaving only a terrible knowing. 3 nights before he disappeared, woke me up at midnight, said he heard the most beautiful voices calling his name. Ezekiel pulled up a wooden stool, his Bible heavy in his hands. Mrs. Miller, I'm deeply sorry. Don't. She finally looked at him, and he saw that her eyes were bloodshot, threaded with red like cracked clay. Don't give me your sorries and your scriptures, preacher. I need you to understand what took my boy, because you're going to go after him. I can see it in you, that same fool curiosity that got Thomas killed. I haven't decided. Yes, you have. Constance set down the shirt and stood, moving to a trunk in the corner. She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages water-stained and brittle. This belonged to my late husband, Caleb. He was a surveyor, came through here in 1831, year after the sanctuary opened. He tried to map it. She handed Ezekiel the journal. The first page bore an inscription in careful script. Property of Caleb Miller, surveyor. May God forgive me for what I've seen. Caleb crossed the river, Constance continued. Came back 3 days later, half mad, speaking in fragments. Took him 2 weeks to die. Fever, the doctor said. But I knew better. That place had gotten into him, was eating him from the inside. Ezekiel opened the journal, his hands trembling. The pages were filled with sketches, maps that made no geometric sense, trees drawn with faces in their bark, a church that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. And everywhere, notes scrawled in increasingly frantic handwriting. Day 1, crossed at dawn. The mist never lifts here. Found structures, cabins, a meeting house, all built from materials that shouldn't exist in this region. Black wood that drinks the light. Day 2. Saw them. The 500. They tend fields that grow crops I cannot name. Their children play games with rules I cannot fathom. Delilah Hayes walked past me, looked through me. Her shadow moves independently. Day 3. The church. Dear God, the church. They've built a church at the center, but it's wrong. The steeple points down, into the earth. The cross is inverted, not in blasphemy, but in revelation. They worship there every sunset, and the songs they sing open doors in the air itself. There's more, Constance said. Read the last entry. Ezekiel flipped to the final pages, where the handwriting had deteriorated into barely legible scratches. I cannot leave. The river won't let me cross back. For 2 days I've tried, but the water burns like acid. Delilah finally spoke to me. Said the Cherokee didn't open a sanctuary. They opened a wound between worlds. Said her people made a bargain with what lives in that wound. Freedom in exchange for guardianship. They can never leave, because they hold the door closed from the inside. If they abandon their post, What waits on the other side will flood through into our world. But the door is weakening, needs to be fed. The 13 who've disappeared didn't stumble into the sanctuary by accident. They were called, chosen. The door needs souls to stay sealed. Delilah let me go as a warning, told me to tell others to stay away. The 500 are dying, generation by generation. When the last of them falls, when there's no one left to stand guard, the door will open fully. We have perhaps a generation, maybe less. Tell them, warn them, don't let anyone else cross. Ezekiel's mouth had gone dry. How did he escape if the river burned? He didn't say, just came stumbling out of the woods 3 days later, drenched and screaming. Constance's voice cracked, spent his last coherent moments writing that. Then the fever took him, and he died speaking in a language I'd never heard. Same language those damned slave catchers spoke after they came back. A knock at the door made them both jump. Jeremiah Blackwood entered without waiting for permission, his face grim. "Reverend, you need to come, now." "What's happened?" "Nathaniel Pike, the survivor from 30, he's been ranting all morning about how the door is opening faster than expected. Says he can feel it in his bones." Jeremiah's massive hands clenched into fists. "But that's not the worst of it. He says Delilah Hayes appeared to him last night. Says she has a message specifically for you." Ezekiel felt ice water flood his veins. "For me? I've never been to the sanctuary. How would she even know I exist?" Jeremiah's eyes were dark with fear. "Pike says she knows everything that happens within 10 miles of that cursed place. Says the sanctuary is growing, spreading like a stain. And she needs someone from the outside, someone with faith, someone willing to understand." "Understand what?" "How to close the door permanently, before the last guardian dies and hell itself comes pouring through." Constance Miller grabbed Ezekiel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "My Thomas is in there, Reverend. If what Caleb wrote is true, if they're feeding the door to keep it closed, then my boy is being used as a sacrifice. You go in there, you find him. You bring him back, or you make sure his death meant something." Ezekiel looked down at Caleb Miller's journal, at the mad sketches of an inverted church, and shadows that moved wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to pack his belongings and flee this cursed corner of Tennessee. But the singing had already gotten into his head. At night, he heard it in his dreams. "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water." Except the water they sang about wasn't the Jordan, it was the Hiwassee, and God had nothing to do with what troubled those depths. "Take me to Pike," Ezekiel said quietly. October 1842, Pike's Shack. Nathaniel Pike lived in squalor 5 miles from the settlement, in a shack that leaned so far to one side, it seemed to defy the laws of nature. As Ezekiel and Jeremiah approached, they could hear him inside, muttering in that strange language, the same tongue that had consumed Caleb Miller's final hours. The door hung open on broken hinges. Inside, the smell was overwhelming. Unwashed flesh, rotting food, and something else, something sweet and wrong that reminded Ezekiel of the scent that came from across the river. Pike sat in the corner, a skeletal man with wild gray hair and eyes that looked in 2 directions at once. His left eye was normal, albeit bloodshot and twitching. His right eye had gone completely black, no white visible, like a hole punched through to some lightless void. "Reverend Brown," Pike said, though he wasn't looking at either of them. "Delilah said you'd come, said you'd smell like righteousness and fear in equal measure." Ezekiel swallowed hard. "Mr. Pike, I understand you have a message for me." Pike laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "A message? Oh, preacher, she gave me much more than that. She gave me sight." He tapped his blackened eye. "This sees what your kind can't, sees the truth of things." "What truth?" Ezekiel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Pike stood abruptly, moving with an unnatural grace that belied his frail appearance. He crossed to the wall where he'd carved symbols, the same ones Ezekiel had seen in Caleb Miller's journal, mixed with others that hurt to look at directly. "In 1830, I was a hard man," Pike began, his voice shifting between his own and something deeper, feminine, ancient. "Caught runaways for money. Good money. Didn't care about the morality of it that was for preachers and abolitionists to argue. I did my job." He traced one of the symbols with a finger that had too many joints. "We tracked Delilah Hayes and her 500 for 3 weeks. Through Georgia, through Carolina, into Tennessee. We had them cornered at the Hiwassee River. No bridge, water running fast, nowhere to go. We were going to make examples of them, especially Delilah. She'd killed 2 overseers to get her people free." Pike turned, and both his eyes were black now, twin voids in his skull. But the Cherokee woman was waiting. Aida. She stood on the far bank and spoke words that made the air crack like ice. "The river parted not like in your Bible, preacher. This was different. Wrong." The water peeled back like skin, and underneath was something else. A passage. Ezekiel felt his heart hammering. Jeremiah had gone pale, one hand gripping his hammer so tight his knuckles had turned white. "Delilah knew what it was," Pike continued, his voice now fully that other voice, that woman's voice. "The Cherokee had opened it 10 years earlier, during a ritual meant to curse the land Andrew Jackson was stealing. But they'd opened more than they intended. They'd torn a hole into the place where dead gods dream." Pike's mouth stretched into a smile too wide for his face. "Delilah made a choice. She could let her people be dragged back to slavery, tortured and killed as warnings to others. Or she could lead them through the wound, into the sanctuary, and make a bargain with what lived there. Protection in exchange for eternal guardianship, freedom at the cost of never leaving, never dying properly, always standing watch over the door. She chose the sanctuary," Ezekiel whispered. "She chose survival, wouldn't you?" Pike cocked his head. "We followed them in 40 armed men, angry and righteous in our own way. The moment we crossed the threshold, the rules changed. Our guns wouldn't fire. Our knives turned to water in our hands, and Delilah, she was transformed. Not just her, all 500. The sanctuary had claimed them, but it had also empowered them. They were guardians now, neither fully alive nor dead, existing in the space between." Pike grabbed Ezekiel's hand with shocking strength. His skin was ice cold. "She let 3 of us leave as warnings, but the door has been weakening since then. The 500 age slowly, but they do age. They have children, but fewer each generation. And the thing on the other side grows stronger, hungrier. It needs to be fed." "The 13 people who disappeared," Ezekiel said, "Thomas Miller and the others." "Sacrifices," Pike confirmed. "But not to the creature to strengthen the guardians. Each soul that crosses and is claimed adds years to the sanctuary's life, buys more time. But it's not enough. It's never enough." He pulled Ezekiel closer, and the preacher could see images reflected in those black eyes, visions of the sanctuary, of Delilah Hayes standing before an inverted church, of children with shadows that moved like living things, of fields where crops grew in patterns that spelled out warnings in languages older than humanity. "Delilah needs you because the door must be closed permanently, not just guarded sealed. The Cherokee who opened it are gone, driven west or dead. The ritual to close it requires someone from outside, someone untainted by the sanctuary's touch, someone with genuine faith." "Faith in what?" Ezekiel demanded. Pike's smile returned, terrible and knowing. "That's what you'll have to discover. The sanctuary exists between Christian and Cherokee beliefs, between freedom and bondage, between life and death. To close it, you must understand what holds it open. You must walk into the wound and not be consumed by it." He released Ezekiel's hand and stumbled backward, collapsing against the wall. When he looked up again, his right eye had returned to normal bloodshot, human, terrified. "Don't go," Pike gasped. His own voice returned. "Whatever she promised, whatever she showed me, it's a trap. The sanctuary doesn't want to be closed, it wants to spread. Delilah thinks she's protecting the world, but she's become part of what she's guarding against. 12 years changes you, makes you forget what you were fighting for." "Which is the truth?" Jeremiah demanded. "What Delilah said or what you're saying now?" Pike laughed bitterly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Both. Neither. The sanctuary is paradox made flesh. It's a prison and a haven, a curse and a blessing. Delilah is both savior and monster. You'll understand when you cross over, Reverend, if you cross over." He pointed a shaking finger at Ezekiel. "Young Thomas Miller is still alive. For now. But he's changing. 3 days is all it takes. After that, you can't bring him back. He'll be bound to the sanctuary forever. You have until tomorrow sunset." Ezekiel felt the weight of decision crushing down on him. Every rational part of his mind screamed to flee. But he thought of Constance Miller's hollow eyes, of Caleb's mad journal, of the 13 marks he'd carved into the oak tree. How do I cross without being claimed? Pike reached into his shirt and pulled out a small pouch on a leather cord. "Aida gave this to me when I stumbled out in 1830, said it would protect me from being called back. Never understood why she helped me. I was her enemy. But she said the sanctuary needed witnesses, needed people to warn others." He handed the pouch to Ezekiel. Inside were herbs, small bones, and a stone carved with symbols that seemed to shift when not looked at directly. "Wear this. It will let you enter without being claimed immediately, but it won't protect you forever. You'll have 3 days, just like the others. Find Thomas, find Delilah, learn the truth, then get out before the sanctuary decides you belong to it." Ezekiel took the pouch with trembling hands. "And Reverend?" Pike's voice dropped to a whisper. "Whatever you do, don't attend their church service. Don't listen when they sing their inverted hymns. Because if you do, you'll understand. And understanding is damnation." October 1842, dawn at the Hiwassee. Ezekiel stood at the river's edge as the first light broke over the Tennessee hills, the protective pouch heavy around his neck. Jeremiah had accompanied him this far, along with 2 others from the settlement, Marcus Webb, a former soldier who'd fought in the Creek War, and Abigail Porter, a midwife whose daughter had disappeared into the sanctuary 6 months prior. "You don't have to do this alone," Marcus said, checking the load in his rifle for the 3rd time, though Pike had warned them that weapons wouldn't function properly beyond the threshold. "Yes, I do." Ezekiel clutched his Bible, the leather worn smooth from years of use. "Pike said the charm only protects one person. If you cross with me, you'll be claimed immediately." Abigail stepped forward, her weathered face set with determination. "My Rebecca is in there. Been 6 months. If there's even a chance." "Mrs. Porter," Ezekiel said gently, 6 months is far beyond 3 days. If what Pike said is true, your daughter is already bound to the sanctuary. She's one of them now." Abigail's face crumpled, but she didn't cry. She'd long since run out of tears. "Then tell her I love her. Tell her I understand why she stayed, that I don't blame her for choosing freedom, even if it's a cursed freedom." Ezekiel nodded, tucking the Bible into his coat. The mist was rising from the river now, thick and unnatural, carrying that sweet rot smell he'd come to associate with the sanctuary. Through the fog, he could see the far bank, where trees grew in configurations that hurt his eyes to perceive directly. 3 days, Jeremiah reminded him. "Pike said you have 3 days before the sanctuary claims you. We'll wait here. You don't come back by sunset on the 3rd day. We're going to assume you're lost." "And then what?" Ezekiel asked. Jeremiah's expression was grim. "Then we burn the bridge we've been building. Make sure no one else can cross easily. Won't stop the sanctuary from spreading, but it might slow it down." Marcus handed Ezekiel a compass. Caleb's journal mentioned that normal directions don't work in there, North becomes south, east becomes west. But this compass was blessed by a Cherokee woman, might be Aida herself. It doesn't point north, it points toward truth. Keep it with you. Ezekiel took the compass, watching as the needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that definitely wasn't magnetic north. It pointed across the river, into the mist, toward the heart of the sanctuary. "Time to wade in the water," he murmured, and stepped into the Hiwassee. The cold hit him first, water numbing his legs even through his boots. But as he pushed deeper, the temperature changed. The water grew warm, then hot, then began to burn with a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the burn of wrongness, of being in a place his body understood he didn't belong. The pouch around his neck grew warm in response, and the burning eased to a tolerable discomfort. Ezekiel pushed forward, the water rising to his waist, his chest, his neck. For one terrifying moment, he went under completely, and in the murky depths, he saw things moving, shapes that were almost human but stretched wrong, faces that opened mouths filled with too many teeth. Then his feet found the opposite bank, and he hauled himself up onto muddy ground. The silence struck him first. Behind him, across the river that now seemed impossibly wide, he could barely see Jeremiah and the others. They appeared faded, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. He could see their mouths moving but heard no sound. Ahead, the forest waited. Ezekiel checked the compass. The needle pointed deeper into the woods, unwavering. He took a step forward, then another, and with each step the world behind him faded further, until it disappeared entirely. The trees here were wrong, just as the locals had said. They grew in spiral patterns, their bark black as coal and smooth as glass. Symbols were carved into them, the same ones from Pike's shack and Caleb's journal. Some were Cherokee, some appeared African, others belonged to no human language he recognized. They seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence, glowing brighter as the mist thickened around him. After walking for what felt like hours but might have been minutes, time moved strangely here. Ezekiel came upon the first structure. It was a cabin, well-maintained, with smoke rising from its chimney. Through the window, he could see movement. A family sat around a table, eating breakfast. A man, a woman, 3 children. They looked normal, almost peaceful, except for one detail that made Ezekiel's skin crawl. Their shadows didn't match their movements. The man raised a cup to his lips, but his shadow reached out to embrace the woman. A child laughed, but its shadow cowered in the corner. The woman turned her head to look directly at the window, directly at Ezekiel, and smiled. Her eyes were black from edge to edge, like Pike's transformed eye. She stood and walked to the door, opening it despite the fact that Ezekiel had made no sound, had tried to remain hidden behind a twisted tree. "Reverend Brown," she said, her voice musical and strange. "We've been expecting you. Delilah wants to see you before sunset. You'll find her at the church." She pointed deeper into the woods, where Ezekiel could now see other structures emerging from the mist, dozens of cabins, a schoolhouse, a well, all arranged around a central clearing. And in that clearing, rising like a blasphemous monument, stood the inverted church. Its steeple plunged into the earth like a stake driven into the world's heart. The building itself seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, sometimes wood, sometimes stone, sometimes something that resembled bone. The cross atop, or beneath, given the inversion, was carved from black wood that drank the light around it. "What's your name?" Ezekiel asked the woman, finding his voice. "I was called Sarah once, Sarah Jennings. I crossed over in the first month, 1,830, been here ever since." She smiled wider, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "It's not so bad, Reverend. You'll see. We're free here. Truly free. No masters, no chains, no running. We built our own world." "At what cost?" Sarah's expression didn't change. but her shadow began to writhe on the ground, forming shapes and symbols that spelled out words: everything, nothing, both, neither. Cost is a concept from the world you left behind, Sarah said. Here, we deal in different currencies. Come, Delilah is waiting, and she doesn't like to be kept waiting. She has much to teach you before you run out of time. And Thomas Miller? Ezekiel demanded. Constance's boy, where is he? Sarah's smile finally faded. The new ones are kept at the church until they understand. Until they accept. Young Thomas is resistant. He still thinks he can go home. Delilah hopes you can convince him otherwise, or convince his mother to let him go. She turned and began walking toward the inverted church, her shadow spreading across the ground like spilled ink. After a moment's hesitation, Ezekiel followed, one hand clutching the pouch, the other gripping his Bible. With each step toward that blasphemous structure, the singing grew louder. Not the spirituals he'd heard from across the river, but something older, something that predated words. It was the sound of the earth itself groaning, of the space between worlds crying out in pain and pleasure simultaneously. And beneath it all, he heard a voice he somehow knew belonged to Delilah Hayes, speaking directly into his mind. Welcome, Reverend. Welcome to the sanctuary. Let me show you what freedom really costs. October 1842, the heart of the sanctuary. The inverted church loomed larger with each step, defying perspective and proportion. What had seemed 100 yards away remained 100 yards away even after Ezekiel had walked for 20 minutes. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, he stood at its threshold. Up close, the structure was even more disturbing. The walls were constructed from black wood that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that didn't match Ezekiel's own heartbeat. The windows were stained glass, but the images depicted within them shifted and changed, scenes of bondage transforming into scenes of freedom, which then twisted into something darker, something that showed the price of that freedom. Sarah Jennings had disappeared, melting into the shadows that congregated around the church like worshippers at an altar. Ezekiel was alone now, standing before the heavy wooden doors carved with symbols that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on them. The doors opened without his touching them. Inside, the church extended both upward and downward simultaneously, creating a dizzying effect that made Ezekiel's stomach lurch. Pews lined both directions, some anchored to the floor he stood on, others hanging from what should have been the ceiling but was somehow also a floor. In the center, where the steeple plunged into the earth, sat an altar made of stone that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of midnight. Delilah Hayes stood before that altar, and she was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. She was tall, her skin the deep brown of Carolina clay, her hair woven with beads and feathers in a style that blended African and Cherokee traditions. Her eyes held the same blackness as Sarah's, but in Delilah there was something more, an intelligence, a power, a presence that filled the entire impossible space. Behind her, bound to posts that grew from the altar like wooden ribs, were the 13. Ezekiel's breath caught. Thomas Miller was there, along with 12 others he recognized from the carved marks on his oak tree. They were alive, but changed. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality, and through it, he could see symbols writing themselves across their bones, burning their way into marrow and blood. "They're becoming anchors," Delilah said, her voice rich and resonant, echoing from both above and below. "The door weakens, Reverend Brown, and it needs new strength. These 13 will hold it closed for another decade, maybe 2, if we're fortunate." "This is murder," Ezekiel said, his hand moving to his Bible. "Constance Miller's boy. These others, you're sacrificing them." Delilah's laugh was like thunder rolling across distant hills. "Sacrifice? Is that what you think this is?" She moved with liquid grace, approaching him until she stood close enough that he could feel the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. "Let me tell you about sacrifice, preacher. Let me tell you about watching your children sold away one by one, about being beaten until you can't stand because you dared to learn to read, about running through swamps with dogs at your heels, knowing that capture means death or worse. Her eyes bored into his, and Ezekiel saw visions, memories that weren't his own. He saw Delilah younger, on a plantation in Georgia, saw her husband hanged for striking an overseer who'd touched their daughter, saw that daughter sold south, screaming for her mother, saw Delilah's back torn open by the whip, saw her thrown into a root cellar for 3 days with no food or water. And he saw her escape, saw her kill 2 overseers with her bare hands, saw her gather others 500 souls who'd suffered as she had and lead them north, always north, toward a freedom that existed only in desperate hope. We reached this river with death at our backs, Delilah continued, releasing him from the visions. The Cherokee woman, Aida, she stood on that bank and offered us a choice. Cross back and die as slaves, or cross forward and live as guardians. We chose life, Reverend. We chose freedom, even though we understood the price. But these children, Ezekiel gestured to the 13 bound figures, they didn't choose. They were called here, tricked. They were invited, Delilah corrected sharply. The sanctuary calls only those who are suffering, who are trapped, who are dying slowly in the world beyond. Look closer, preacher. Look with more than your righteous eyes. Ezekiel approached Thomas Miller, studying the boy's translucent face, and then he saw what Delilah meant. Beneath the transformation, beneath the symbols burning into his bones, he saw bruises. Recent ones, a broken rib, poorly healed, the mark of a belt across his shoulders. His stepfather, Delilah said softly, started beating him after his real father died. Constance couldn't stop it, couldn't protect him. Thomas prayed every night for escape, for somewhere safe. The sanctuary heard. It always hears the desperate prayers. Ezekiel moved down the line, seeing similar signs on each of the 13. The girl who'd been married off at 13 to a man 3 times her age. The boy who'd been worked nearly to death in a mill. The woman who'd lost everything to a husband's gambling debts. Each one had called out for salvation, and the sanctuary had answered. You're still taking them against their will, Ezekiel said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Are we? Or are we offering them what your God won't? Genuine sanctuary, genuine protection. Delilah's hand swept across the bound figures. They're frightened now. Yes, transformation is always frightening. But in 3 days, when the process completes, they'll understand. They'll be free of pain, free of hunger, free of the cruelties that plague your world. And they'll have purpose holding the door closed, protecting both worlds from what waits on the other side. Show me, Ezekiel demanded. Show me what's on the other side. Show me what you're really protecting us from. Delilah smiled, and it was a sad expression, full of knowledge that had cost her dearly. Are you certain? Once you see, you can't unsee. Once you understand, you become complicit. The sanctuary will have a claim on you, protection pouch or not. Ezekiel's hand tightened on his Bible. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to flee, to get Thomas and run back across that river. But he thought of Pike's words, understanding is damnation, and realized that damnation might be necessary. How could he close a door if he didn't understand what it was keeping out? Show me. Delilah nodded and turned to the altar. She placed both hands on the midnight stone and began to sing. Not the spirituals, not the corrupted hymns, but something older. Words in that pre-human language that made Ezekiel's teeth ache and his bones vibrate. The altar began to crack, and through the fissures, light emerged, but it was wrong light, black light, illumination that somehow created darkness instead of dispelling it. And in that darkness, Ezekiel saw. He saw the thing that waited on the other side of the door, a vast consciousness that was neither God nor demon, but something older, something that existed before those concepts had meaning. It was hunger and desire made manifest, an entity that fed on suffering and would consume entire worlds if given the chance. It had been sealed away before recorded history, locked in a place between places. The Cherokee ritual hadn't created it. They'd accidentally weakened one of the ancient seals. And Delilah's 500 had become the new lock, their very existence holding it at bay. But the seal was failing. Ezekiel could see it now, cracks spreading through the barrier, the thing pushing against it with patient, terrible strength. Another generation, maybe less, and it would break through. Unless the door was properly closed. Unless someone performed the counter-ritual that the fleeing Cherokee hadn't had time to complete. Delilah released the altar, and the vision faded, leaving Ezekiel gasping, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. "Now you understand," she said quietly. "Now you know why we can't simply let the sanctuary fade. Why we need the 13. Why we need you. The Cherokee who opened this door are scattered or dead. Only someone with genuine faith, someone who believes in forces greater than themselves, can perform the closing ritual." "And if I do?" Ezekiel asked. "If I close it permanently?" Delilah's expression grew even sadder. "Then the 500 are freed from our guardianship. We can finally die, truly die, and find whatever rest awaits us. But until then, we endure. And we protect, because someone must." October 1842, Day 2 in the sanctuary. Ezekiel spent the night in a cabin that had been prepared for him, though sleep proved impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that thing beyond the door, the ancient hunger that pressed against reality like a hand against thin fabric, stretching it, testing it, waiting for the moment it would tear through. When dawn came, though, how he knew it was dawn in a place where the mist never lifted and the light remained constant, he couldn't say Sarah Jennings brought him breakfast. Cornbread and preserves, coffee that smelled normal but tasted of herbs he couldn't identify. "You saw it," Sarah said, sitting across from him. It wasn't a question. "Everyone who sees it changes. Delilah showed you mercy by waiting until your second day. Some she shows immediately, and they break." "How do you endure it?" Ezekiel asked, pushing the food around his plate. "Knowing that thing is right there, separated from our world by nothing but your collective will." Sarah's smile was gentle, almost pitying. "You think we endure? Reverend, we don't endure. We've accepted." "There's a difference." She gestured around the cabin, out the window to where children played in the mist, their laughter echoing strangely. "This is our world now. We built it, we maintain it, we protect it. In the old world, we were property. Here, we're purpose incarnate. But you can't leave. You can't truly live." "Can't we?" Sarah leaned forward, her black eyes reflecting Ezekiel's face back at him, distorted and strange. "What is life, preacher? Is it the ability to move freely? Or is it the freedom to be yourself without fear? We have children here. Rebecca Porter, Abigail's daughter. She's with child now. First baby born entirely within the sanctuary. What will that child be? Neither bound nor free in the way you understand those words. Something new, something that exists outside your categories." Before Ezekiel could respond, the door opened, and a young man entered broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes that hadn't yet gone fully black. He still had white showing around the edges. "Reverend Brown? I'm Isaac Freeman. Was a blacksmith's apprentice before I crossed over 3 years ago." He extended a hand, and Ezekiel shook it, feeling the unnatural warmth of sanctuary, touched flesh. "Delilah asked me to show you around. Said you needed to see what we've built before you make your decision." "What decision?" Ezekiel asked, though he already knew. Isaac's expression was grave. Whether to close the door and doom us all, or leave it as it is, and let us continue our guardianship. They walked through the sanctuary, as the perpetual mist swirled around them. Isaac showed Ezekiel the fields where crops grew in impossible abundance, plants that bore fruit and grain simultaneously, harvests that never failed. He showed him the schoolhouse where children learned not just reading and arithmetic, but the old ways Cherokee wisdom mixed with African traditions, Christian parables reinterpreted through the lens of their unique existence. We teach them about the door, Isaac explained, as they watched a young girl recite the history of the sanctuary in that strange mixed language. Every child knows what we hold back, knows that their existence has meaning beyond themselves. They visited the workshop where craftsmen created tools from the black wood that grew throughout the sanctuary, wood that never rotted, never broke, that seemed to shape itself to the user's needs. They saw the healing house where the sick were tended by women who'd learned to manipulate the sanctuary's energies, curing illnesses that would be fatal in the outside world. It's beautiful in its way, Ezekiel admitted reluctantly, but it's still a prison. Is it? Isaac stopped at the edge of the settlement, where the mist grew thicker and the trees pressed closer. Or is the world you come from the real prison? You're free to leave, yes, but free to do what? Free to watch your children sold? Free to be beaten for learning to read? Free to die young and forgotten? He pointed beyond the mist. Out there, past the boundary, is what we call the threshold. It's where the sanctuary meets the true prison, the space where that thing presses against our world. We take shifts there, strengthening the barrier with our presence. Want to see what we're really protecting you from? Ezekiel's hand went to the pouch around his neck, feeling its warmth. He'd been in the sanctuary for a day and a night, 2 more days before it claimed him. Show me. They walked into the deeper mist, and Ezekiel felt the temperature drop. The warmth of the sanctuary faded, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with winter. The trees here were different, twisted into shapes that hurt to perceive, their branches reaching not towards sky or ground but towards some other direction entirely. At the threshold, a dozen figures stood in a circle, hands joined, singing in that pre-human language. Among them, Ezekiel recognized Rebecca Porter Abigail's daughter. She was visibly pregnant, her belly swollen, and her eyes were completely black. But unlike the others, she was smiling, genuinely smiling, as she sang. Beyond them, the barrier was visible, a membrane of reality stretched so thin it had become translucent, and through it, Ezekiel could see the thing pressing against it, closer now than in Delilah's vision. Tendrils of wrongness pushed through tiny cracks, quickly sealed by the singer's efforts. We rotate shifts, Isaac said quietly. 6 hours on, 6 hours off. It's exhausting, but necessary. The door weakens more each year. The 13 that Delilah is transforming, they'll buy us time, but not enough. Eventually, we'll run out of people. Eventually, the door will fail. Unless I close it properly, Ezekiel said. Unless you close it properly. Isaac turned to face him. But here's what Delilah didn't tell you, what she can't bring herself to admit. Closing the door requires a permanent anchor. Someone must remain on this side, must become one with the sanctuary itself, must exist forever as the living seal. The Cherokee who opened it fled because they understood this. They couldn't bear to sacrifice one of their own. Ezekiel's blood ran cold. Delilah knows this. She suspects. The ritual knowledge is fragmentary pieces she's gathered from Cherokee writings, from the memories embedded in the sanctuary itself, from visions granted by whatever power sustains this place. But yes, she knows that closing the door means someone stays behind, forever. And she wants me to. She wants you to choose. Either perform the ritual and become the eternal seal, freeing the 500 to finally die and rest. Or refuse, and let us continue as we are, slowly failing, until the day comes when that thing breaks through and consumes everything. Isaac's voice dropped to a whisper. There's a third option, though. One Delilah won't speak of because it terrifies her. We could open the door fully, let that thing through. Some of us believe it might not be the monster we think it is, that maybe it's been imprisoned unjustly, that maybe its hunger is simply the desire for freedom, like ours once was. That's madness, Ezekiel said. I saw what it is. It would devour. Would it? Or would it transform? The sanctuary transformed us, made us into something between life and death, slavery and freedom. Maybe that thing could be transformed too. Maybe that's what it wants not to destroy, but to become. Ezekiel stared at the barrier, at the thing pressing against it with patient, terrible hunger. 3 choices, each one impossible. Become the eternal seal and save everyone at the cost of his own soul. Refuse and let the sanctuary continue its slow decline. Or commit the ultimate blasphemy and release the very thing they'd all been fighting to contain. How long do I have to decide? He asked. Isaac checked the sky, though there was no sun to mark time by. Delilah will summon you tonight for the ritual. If you're going to attempt the closing, it must be done at midnight of your 3rd day, the moment before the sanctuary would claim you naturally. That's when you'll be balanced between worlds, when the ritual has its best chance of success. And Thomas Miller? The others? If you close the door, they'll be released from their transformation, restored to what they were. If you refuse, they complete their change and become anchors like the rest of us. If you open the door, Isaac shrugged, then none of it matters. We'll all be consumed or transformed into something else entirely. He placed a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. I don't envy you, Reverend. Delilah chose 12 years ago, and it cost her everything. Now you have to choose. And unlike her, you've got less than 2 days to decide the fate of 2 worlds. October 1842, Day 3, morning. Ezekiel found Aida exactly where Isaac said she would be, at the oldest part of the sanctuary, where the original Cherokee ritual site still stood. She was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles, her hair white as the perpetual mist. But her eyes were clear, human, untouched by the sanctuary's darkness. You can leave whenever you wish, Ezekiel said, approaching her carefully. You're not bound like the others. Why do you stay? Aida didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the stone circle before her 7 standing stones covered in symbols that predated even the Cherokee language. Because I opened the door, Reverend. Me and 6 others. We thought we were cursing Andrew Jackson's stolen land. We thought we were calling upon the spirits of our ancestors to make this place uninhabitable for the white thieves. She finally turned to face him, and Ezekiel saw tears on her weathered cheeks. We didn't know what we were truly summoning. Didn't understand that beneath all our spirits and gods, beneath everything we thought we knew about the world, there were older things. Things that had been sealed away before the first human drew breath. The entity, Ezekiel said. The hunger that waits, Aida corrected. That's what my people called it in the oldest stories, the ones only the medicine keepers remembered. It existed before the world took shape, before light and dark separated. It's not evil in the way you understand it simply is, and it hungers to exist again, to touch reality, to transform everything it touches into extensions of itself. She gestured to the stones. We cracked the seal, and Delilah's people became the patch. I stay because I must witness what my pride and anger wrought. I stay because I alone remember the full ritual, the opening and the closing both. Ezekiel's heart raced. Then you know how to seal it properly? How to close the door without it failing again? Aida's smile was sad and knowing. I know, and I know what it costs. The question is, Reverend Brown, do you have the strength to pay it? She led him to the stones, placing his hands on the largest one. The moment his skin touched the ancient rock, visions flooded through him, not like Delilah's visions of the past, but glimpses of possible futures. He saw himself performing the ritual at midnight, speaking the words in that ancient tongue, feeling his body dissolve and reform, becoming one with the sanctuary itself. Saw himself spread thin across the entire space, his consciousness fragmented into 1,000 pieces, each one eternally vigilant, eternally holding the door closed. Saw the 500 released, their bonds broken, finally allowed to age and die as humans should. Saw Thomas Miller return to his mother, frightened but whole. But he also saw the cost. saw himself losing his humanity piece by piece, decade by decade, until nothing remained but purpose, an eternal sentinel with no memories of who he'd been, no understanding of why he stood guard, only the endless, crushing duty of keeping the door sealed. The vision shifted. He saw himself refusing, walking back across the river with Thomas, leaving the sanctuary to its slow decline. Saw the years passing, saw the 500 growing fewer, saw children like Rebecca's baby growing up, knowing they were born to die at their posts. Saw the day, perhaps 30 years hence, when the last guardian fell, and the hunger that waits finally broke through. That vision was worse than anything he'd imagined. The entity didn't simply destroy, it transformed. It touched the world, and reality itself began to change, becoming fluid, becoming hunger, becoming an extension of that ancient consciousness. People became things that were neither alive nor dead. Cities became architectures of impossible geometry, and the very laws of nature rewrote themselves according to alien logic. The third vision was the most disturbing because it was the most seductive. He saw Isaac's choice opening the door deliberately, with intent and preparation. Saw Delilah and her people standing ready, not to fight the hunger, but to negotiate with it, to offer themselves as willing vessels for transformation. In this vision, the hunger didn't rampage. It flowed into the sanctuary and into the 500, merging with them, becoming something new, neither human nor ancient entity, but a synthesis. And in that synthesis, Ezekiel saw a terrible beauty beings of immense power who could reshape reality with thought, who existed beyond pain and suffering, beyond bondage and freedom, beyond all the cruel limitations of mortal existence. But he also saw the price. Humanity itself would end. Not destroyed, but transcended, transformed into something that remembered being human the way a butterfly might remember being a caterpillar, a distant, increasingly irrelevant past. Aida pulled his hands from the stone, and Ezekiel gasped, falling to his knees. The visions had felt like hours, but only moments had passed. "Now you see all the paths," Aida said. "The sacrifice, the decline, or the transformation. 3 futures, each one terrible in its own way." "How do I choose?" Ezekiel asked, his voice breaking. "How did you choose to open the door in the first place?" "I chose in anger and pride, and I was wrong." Aida knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. They were surprisingly warm, surprisingly human. "But you, Reverend, you must choose in wisdom and humility. You must look at these 3 futures and ask not which one you can bear, but which one is right." "What's right?" Ezekiel laughed bitterly. "How can any of this be right?" "Perhaps none of it is. Perhaps we're already damned, all of us, and we're simply choosing how we fall." She stood, helping him to his feet. "But I must believe that even in damnation, there are degrees, that some choices, while terrible, are more merciful than others." A bell began to toll from the inverted church, deep, resonant, wrong. It counted out 12 strokes, though it was nowhere near midnight. "Delilah is calling you," Aida said. "She's prepared the ritual space. Thomas Miller and the others have been brought to full awareness. She wants you to see them, speak to them, understand their choice before you make yours." "And if I can't decide? If I simply take Thomas and run?" Aida's expression was pitying. "Then the sanctuary will claim you both at midnight anyway. The 3-day protection isn't a gift, Reverend. It's a timer. You crossed into this place, and now it has a hold on you. The only way out is through sacrifice, through transformation, or through death." Ezekiel checked his pouch, feeling it growing warmer against his chest. The protection was indeed fading. He could feel the sanctuary's pull now, gentle but insistent, like a current in deep water. "There's something else," Aida said as he turned toward the church. "Something Delilah doesn't know because I've never told anyone. The ritual that closes the door, It doesn't have to be performed by just one person. If enough souls offered themselves willingly, the burden could be shared. The sacrifice distributed among many rather than crushing a single individual. How many? 13 would do it. 13 willing souls, bound together in purpose, could become the seal without losing themselves entirely. They would be changed, yes. Bound to the sanctuary forever, yes. But they would retain their minds, their memories, their essential selves. They could even take turns, rotating like the guardians at the threshold. Ezekiel's mind raced. The 13 that Delilah is transforming could serve that purpose, if they chose it willingly, if they understood what they were offering and accepted it freely. Aida placed a hand on his shoulder. That's why I'm telling you this now. You have one more option, Reverend. Not sacrifice, not decline, not transformation, but shared burden. But it requires something perhaps more difficult than dying. It requires honest truth, vulnerable persuasion, and 13 desperate souls choosing hope over despair. The bell tolled again, a single stroke that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. Go, Aida said. Speak to them. Tell them everything, the truth, the lies, the possibilities. And then, at midnight, we'll all learn what kind of people we truly are. October 1842, Day 3, approaching midnight. The 13 stood unbound now, arranged in a circle around the inverted altar. Delilah had released them from their posts, and the symbols that had been burning into their bones had faded to a dull glow beneath translucent skin. They were aware, conscious, caught between transformation and humanity. Thomas Miller stood among them, his young face etched with confusion and terror, but also something else, a strange peace that came from finally being safe from his stepfather's fists. Ezekiel entered the church with Aida at his side. Delilah stood at the altar, her expression unreadable. Isaac, Sarah, Rebecca Porter, and dozens of others filled the impossible space the 500 gathered to witness what would happen next. You told them? Delilah asked Aida, her voice tight. I told him what he needed to know, Aida replied calmly. What you should have told him from the beginning. Delilah's jaw clenched, but she nodded. I was afraid. Afraid he'd choose himself over us. Afraid the truth would drive him away. She turned to Ezekiel. I won't apologize for trying to save my people, Reverend, but I will honor whatever choice you make. Ezekiel stepped into the center of the circle, facing the 13. I need to speak with all of you. Not as a preacher, not as someone trying to save you, but as someone who's been given an impossible choice and who's discovered you might have one too. He told them everything. About the visions Aida had shown him, about the entity beyond the door, about the 3 futures he'd seen. He explained what Delilah had planned, that they would become anchors, buying the sanctuary more time but ultimately just delaying the inevitable. Then he told them about the 4th option. 13 souls, willingly bound together, could close the door permanently, he said. Not as prisoners, not as sacrifices, but as guardians who choose their burden with open eyes. You would be changed, yes. You would never leave this place, but you would keep your minds, your memories, yourselves. You could take turns at the threshold, rest and live, and even love in the spaces between. And the 500 who've endured for 12 years could finally be free. Thomas Miller spoke first, his voice cracking with youth and fear. What about my mother? Will I ever see her again? Ezekiel's heart broke. No. If you accept this, you stay here forever. But your mother would know you chose it. That you weren't taken, but that you gave yourself to protect her and everyone else. A young woman named Grace stepped forward. Ezekiel recognized her from the visions, as the girl married off too young. And if we refuse, if we say we want to go home, then I become the seal alone, Ezekiel said quietly. I sacrifice myself, and you all go free. The door closes, the sanctuary ends, and you return to the world you came from. To the abuse, Thomas said bitterly, to the men who hurt us, who broke us. To life, Ezekiel corrected. Real life, with all its pain and all its possibility. The choice must be yours. I won't trick you, won't manipulate you. But you need to understand, if I seal the door alone, I lose everything. My consciousness, my humanity, my soul. I become nothing but eternal duty. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The mist swirled around them, and beyond the church walls, Ezekiel could hear the thing pressing against the barrier, sensing that the moment of decision approached. Finally, an older man named Solomon spoke. He'd been the last to be taken, only a week before Ezekiel arrived. I was a school teacher. They burned my school because I taught colored children to read, beat me nearly to death, and told me next time they'd hang me. He looked around at the others. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, because the sanctuary called and promised safety. He turned to Delilah. You gave us that. 12 years of peace for the others, a week for me. But peace bought with deception is just another kind of bondage. Then to Ezekiel, if we do this, if we choose to become the seal together, we do it freely. Not because you're guilting us, not because Delilah needs us, but because we understand the weight and accept it anyway. One by one, the others nodded. Grace, Thomas, a boy named Jacob who'd nearly died in a mill accident, a woman named Hannah who'd lost her children to disease and prayed for death. Each of them had been broken by the world outside. Each had been called by desperation, but now they were being offered something different, not rescue, but purpose, not salvation, but meaning. I'll do it, Thomas said, his voice steady now. Not for the world that hurt me, but for the mother who loved me, so she never has to fear what's beyond this door. I'll do it, Grace echoed, because I'm tired of being a victim. I want to be a guardian instead. One by one, all 13 agreed, not with joy, not with enthusiasm, but with the quiet dignity of people who'd survived hell and chosen to stand between it and others. Delilah's eyes, black as void, filled with very human tears. You're certain? Once the ritual begins, there's no turning back. We're certain, Solomon said for all of them. Ezekiel felt the weight lift from his shoulders even as he recognized the enormity of what these 13 were accepting. Then I'll guide the ritual. Aida will speak the words. And at midnight, when the sanctuary's claim on me reaches its peak, I'll use that connection to bind you all together, not as prisoners, but as a covenant. Aida began to chant, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. The stones in the circle outside began to glow, their light filtering through the church walls. The 13 joined hands, forming their own circle within the larger space. Ezekiel stood at the center, Bible in one hand, the other reaching for the altar. He felt the sanctuary's pull now, urgent and demanding. Midnight approached minutes away, then seconds. As Aida's chant reached its crescendo, Ezekiel spoke his own prayer, not from scripture, but from his heart. A prayer for these 13 brave souls, for the 500 who'd endured so long, for Delilah who'd made an impossible choice 12 years ago, for Aida who'd lived with her mistake, and for himself, a man who'd come seeking answers and found only more questions. The clock struck midnight. Light erupted from the altar, not the black light of the entity's hunger, but something else. Something that held both darkness and illumination, bondage and freedom, sacrifice and grace. The 13 gasped as the binding took hold, their consciousnesses merging and separating simultaneously, becoming individual and collective at once. Ezekiel felt himself being torn apart and remade, his essence spreading through the ritual before being pulled back into his own body. He'd served as the conduit, the bridge between worlds, but the 13 had become the seal itself. When the light faded, the 13 still stood, but they were changed. Their eyes held depths that hadn't been there before, not the black void of the sanctuary's claim, but a knowing vastness. They were still themselves, but more. They were guardians, truly and completely. And the door was sealed. Ezekiel felt it slam shut, with a finality that shook reality. The barrier at the threshold solidified, became unbreakable. The entity's presence faded, not destroyed but locked away permanently, relegated once more to its prison beyond existence. Delilah collapsed, and so did the others, all 500 falling to their knees as the bonds that had held them for 12 years shattered. They were aging in moments, their bodies catching up to the years they should have lived. But they were free, truly free. "Go," Ezekiel told them, helping Delilah to her feet. "Cross the river. Return to the world. You've earned your rest." Delilah looked at the 13, at these souls who'd chosen to take her burden. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for what we couldn't do, choosing freely instead of being forced." As dawn broke, real dawn, the first the sanctuary had seen in 12 years, the 500 began their exodus. They crossed the river that no longer burned, emerged into a world that had moved on without them, carrying stories no one would believe but everyone needed to hear. Ezekiel stayed behind, sitting with the 13 as they adjusted to their new existence. Thomas smiled at him, and it was genuine. "Tell my mother I love her," the boy said, "and tell her I finally found somewhere I belong." Ezekiel would carry that message, and so many others, back across the river. But first, he sat with the new guardians and taught them what Aida had taught him: how to rest between shifts, how to maintain their humanity while fulfilling their duty, how to find joy in purpose. The sanctuary still existed, but it was different now. Not a wound in the world, but a wall. Not a prison, but a fortress. And 13 souls stood eternal watch, not because they had to, but because they chose to. In the end, that choice made all the difference. The end.